Hello and welcome to Mind Wars Masterclass. My name is Chaitanya Sant and I teach subjects of mass media, history and political science. Since the beginning of the 17th century, the European powers were involved in a race, and this race was capturing more territories in Asia and Africa because Asia and Africa was rich in her natural resources. This process of establishing colonies in Asia and Africa by exercising control was known as the process of colonization. Can you tell me which was the country that was leading this race in establishing colonies? I'm sure your guess is right. They were the mighty European powers, also known as the colonial masters, and they were the British. The British, with their policies of imperial expansion, were successful in establishing colonies in almost each and every country in Asia and Africa. They arrived in India in the 17th century and, taking advantage of the unstable political conditions, exercised complete domination over Hindustan. In this masterclass, we are going to speak about how this mighty European powers had to bow down and grant India independence after almost 300 years of rule. The success of the revolt of 1857 was the rule of the East India Company was dissolved and India's administration was now taken over by the British Parliament. The first good thing that happened with the British Parliament taking control of India's administration was the introduction of Western education. So India saw the rise of a Western educated society, which eventually established the first and the oldest political party in India in 1885, which was the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress provided a platform for Indians to express their views, which eventually was an extremely important reason why we received independence. The Indian National Congress eventually played a vital role in the entire freedom struggle. This was also the time when there was growing national sentiment in the state of Bengal. People were protesting and the shouts of Vande Mataram could be heard all across the streets. Fearing this growing national sentiment, Viceroy Lord Curzon decided to divide the state of Bengal. East Bengal had majority of Muslims, West had majority of Hindus, and thus Bengal was divided into East and West. And this was the seed sown by the British of their infamous policy of divide and rule. They thought this division would curb the growing national sentiment, but all that happened was that protests amplified. This resulted in the Vanga Bhanga movement, and people were protesting against the division of Bengal. The protest was so much that eventually in 1911, Lord Curzon had to cancel the division of Bengal and was also forced to change the headquarters or the capital of the British government in India from Calcutta to Delhi. Were you aware of this? That before 1911, the British capital of India was not Delhi but was Calcutta. But because of the growing protest in Calcutta, they shifted their capital in 1911 from Calcutta to Delhi. Did this curb the growing national sentiments? Definitely not. Protesters were on the rise and national sentiments was on an all-time high. This was also the time where there was the growth of radical nationalists. Three men who realized that we cannot ask the Britishers to leave. We have to kick them out of the country. And they were the extremists, famously known as Lal, Bal and Pal. Lal, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal is Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Pal is Bipin Chandra Pal. It was Lokmanya Tilak who also started his two newspapers, and that was Kesari and Maratha, and spread his ideologies through his powerful editorials that he wrote in his two newspapers. Then comes the year 1915, when a barrister from South Africa arrives in India, a man by the name of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, with his two unique weapons of Ahimsa and Satyagraha. He was already known worldwide because of his mass non-violent demonstration in South Africa to fight against racial discrimination. He came to India with the sole purpose of gaining independence for the country from the rule of the British. That was also the time when the Britishers had introduced a new unjust law called as the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act meant that the British officers could imprison anyone without any justification. Fundamental rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of speech were curbed, and social gatherings were not allowed. The problem with the Rowlatt Act was it was not properly publicized, as a result of which people were not aware of the restrictions. Then comes 13th April 1919. Amritsar, and a place called Jallianwala Bagh. It was a social gathering of people, innocent crowd who had gathered at the Jallianwala Bagh to celebrate the festival of Baisakhi, not knowing that they had actually broken a law. The man who was in charge of the security of Amritsar was a man by the name of General Dyer. He entered the Jallianwala Bagh through its narrow corridors and blocked the entry, which also was the exit. He realized that this is an ideal time to teach Indians a lesson in obedience. He ordered his troops to open fire, and the firing that lasted for several minutes resulted in hundreds of deaths and thousands being injured. Innocent crowd was fired upon, and this event is known as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. This massacre left a lot of repercussions on the British government and added fuel to the already existing fire of fighting against the British. The Indians realized that now we had to fight against a government which treated us with utmost disrespect. Meanwhile, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, also now being referred to as the Mahatma, a title that was conferred to him on 27 January 1915 at a grand reception that was held in Rasalala. Greats such as Rabindranath Tagore also were now referring to M.K. Gandhi as the Mahatma. So after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Mahatma and the Indian National Congress launched the non-cooperation movement to protest against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and to extend their support to the Khilafat movement. But the Mahatma was always saying one thing, that each and every non-cooperation activity that you do is supposed to be non-violent. Ahimsa was his very powerful weapon, and he wanted Indians to use it as well. So the following what happened was, titles were given back to the British government, government schools were boycotted, and there were big slogans and chants of India's independence all across the streets in India. The Mahatma was not allowed to enter Delhi. He defied the orders, and thus he was put in jail. But this did not stop the protests. The non-cooperation movement had gained super momentum, but suddenly it had to be taken back because of a violent event that took place in a place called as Chauri Chaura, when an angry mob set fire to a police station that resulted in the death of 22 policemen. Due to this violent event that took place at Chauri Chaura, the Mahatma had to take back and cancel the non-cooperation movement in the year 1922. Meanwhile, there was a rise of revolutionary activities and revolutionaries in India who decided that we had to take up arms, that is guns and weapons, to fight against the British. One such organization was the HSRA, that's the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, who in 1925 decided to loot the British treasury at the Kakori railway station. This came to be known as the Kakori conspiracy. Meanwhile, a young member of the HSRA was a young boy by the name of Bhagat Singh, and his two acts of courage made him the folk hero of the Indian freedom struggle. Bhagat Singh, along with Sukhdev and Rajguru, assassinated Colonel Saunders, a British officer who was responsible for the death of Lala Lajpat Rai in a lathi charge when they were protesting against the Simon Commission. That's not it. Bhagat Singh, along with Batukeshwar Dutt, on 8th April 1929, threw a bomb in the Central Legislative Assembly with the purpose of letting the British know of their unjust and their cruel activities that they were performing on the Indians. As a result of which, eventually Bhagat Singh was caught, and on 23rd March 1931, at the age of 23, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev and Rajguru were hanged. Their leader Chandrasekhar Azad was also silenced when he was cornered at the Alfred Park with no chance of escaping. He had taken an oath of remaining free, Azad, and thus, using his pistol, he shot himself. At the same time, there were other revolutionary organizations as well, like the Anushilan Samiti, Yugandhar by Khudiram Bose, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar had started the Abhin of Bharat, there was Gadar Party, and there was the India House. These revolutionaries spread terror among the Britishers. In the year 1930, the Mahatma launched the civil disobedience movement with the famous Dandi March, wherein he and his followers walked from the Sabarmati Ashram to the shores of Dandi, covering a distance of 240 miles. The entire nation participated in the civil disobedience movement by the boycott of foreign goods, schools, colleges, and offices. For this, of course, the Mahatma and the senior members of the Congress were once again arrested. These combined efforts of the Indians finally bore their fruit with the Government of India Act, which prescribed provincial autonomy in state legislatures. And thus, in 1937, state legislative elections were held and the Congress captured 7 out of the 11 provinces, which was quite a victory for the Indian National Congress and quite a big step towards Indian independence. But just 2 years after these provincial governments were set up, in 1939, September, the Second World War starts. And the man responsible for the Second World War, Hitler, had waged a war against England. The Indian National Congress told the Britishers that we will help you in your cause of fighting against Hitler, but in return, we want independence. The Britishers refused, and the members of the Indian National Congress resigned in protest. Simultaneously, a radical nationalist by the name of Subhash Chandra Bose had raised the Azad Hind Sena, also called as the Indian National Army. He was making use of his Sena to fight against the Britishers. He had given the war cry, "Tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga," and instructed his army, "Chalo Delhi." In 1942, while the Second World War was in progress, the Mahatma told Indians, "Karo ya maro par bina hathiyar uthaye," and that was do or die, the last straw for the British rule in India. The do or die movement started, and once again, it was not a surprise, but the Mahatma was again arrested by the Britishers. This did not stop the protests. The sweet dream of independence was within the reach of India, and there was no stopping the Indians now. The fear of death no longer existed, and independence was now just a matter of time. However, while all this was happening, the seeds sown by the British in 1905 had now borne their fruit, the seeds of divide and rule. Because now in 1946, Muhammad Ali Jinnah had now started a demand of a separate nation for the Muslims, the nation of Pakistan. The senior members of the Congress refused this, and the Mahatma also said that my country, India, will be divided only over my dead body. But Jinnah was adamant, and he told the Congress that if you don't give me a separate nation of Pakistan, there will be a civil war. The Mahatma and the Congress had no option but to agree to it. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, came to India with the sole intention of giving us independence. Little did he know that with the exit of British, 2 separate nations were going to be created. Pakistan was created, and Independence Day in Pakistan was celebrated on the 14th of August, and India, after decades and centuries of fighting against her colonial masters, finally broke the shackles of dependence and became independent on 15th August 1947 with the historic speech of our first Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru from the Lal Killa. A country which fought almost for a century for freedom adopted democracy as a form of government. And as of today, this very democracy, considerably new, is considered as the largest and the most successful democracy in the world. This process of decolonization that started in India inspired our neighboring continent as well. And in the following decades after India's independence, countries in Africa also gained independence, taking inspiration from the Indian freedom struggle. Log into Z5 and play Mind Wars. Want to be the first one to know about the videos on Mind Wars YouTube channel? Hit subscribe and press the bell icon.